I connected with this month's interviewee back in August during the Heart of the Valley Book Fair in Madera, California. Steven has an epic sci-fi series based on a mixture of history and real cultures. So please join me in welcoming Steven Ramirez. Hey, Steven, tell me about your work and what it is that you write.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Garrett. I write science fiction. I've written a trilogy called the S'Orne Saga. The first book is The Great Migration. It's kind of a mashup of, it's an alternate dimension setting. There are interdimensional refugees going into a low-tech society. They're very mysterious, obviously. The low-tech society has no idea where they come from, but essentially, the big issue is that when they come through this dimensional breach, they spread a disease for which nobody in that low tech world has resistance. So everywhere they appear, it's just a disaster. It's basically a disease apocalypse. And that was kind of the core of the story, and I built everything around that.
How did you get into writing? Was this something that you've always wanted to do, or you just like you came to a point where you're like, I want to write a book?
No, actually, I have never thought about writing anything. I was, I mean, this was a complete spur of the moment. I was just really mad at the way Game of Thrones ended on TV, like season 8, how bad it was. And I would not stop complaining about it. And after about a week or two of listening to me, and my friends and I are texting each other about, now this is terrible, that was terrible, blah, blah, blah. She goes, "Why can't you let this go?" And I said, "Because that was such a good show. It was probably the best thing I'd seen on television. And that 8th season was a disaster." And at some point in the conversation, I said, "Is it really so hard to end a story?" And she said, "I don't know. Why don't you go over to the computer, write a story, and find out?" And so I was like, "Yeah." I was literally went, "Yeah, I'm going to go do that."
So aside from putting your frustrations with Game of Thrones on blast and your work in pharmaceutical sales, what are some of your other inspirations as a writer?
One of my hobbies is hiking, and I got really into it. And I was taking like these long hikes. I was taking like these really long endurance hikes. So I started reading about survival strategies, just to get some base knowledge.
Mhm.
Reading survival books. As I was writing the story, I thought, you know what, like deep survival had a lot of stuff I could use for this, or the Disaster Diaries or the Unthinkable. I started revisiting those books and taking a lot of notes. So I had this master file of notes. And when you read that book, in my books, anytime you get to a lesson on survival or the economy, like anything like that, I really did research every single part of it. None of it, with the exception of, I obviously didn't take any contemporary religions, but I did base, there's a religious theme and a lot of animosity between the religious factions. That,
Mhm.
of course, wasn't hard to draw upon. In anywhere you look, anybody whose religion isn't matching up, you can find conflict in the world, or that's an old story to tell. But it was really, once I started to revisit books that I thought were going to help make my book read more realistically, more genuinely, then I started to look for books on certain topics. Like for world building, I think it's a masterwork. And he basically talks about human history and how we got to where we are, and talked about the different latitudes that would allow for domestication of plants and certain animal species that could be domesticated, and how where those species, the plants and animals existed, society flourished.
Yeah.
And where they didn't exist, human society, kind of stayed stuck in the hunter-gatherer mode. And he built upon that, and then talked about, disease resistance, all these other things, where technology, human interaction, where like different societies from that are very distant from each other. Where they came together, you saw an explosion of ideas, but also an explosion of disease, which of course equaled an explosion of im- immunity to these diseases. And just I found it to be fascinating. So found myself looking for books, getting the ideas, and trying to use them to apply to my story.
So, I mean, this sounds like a pretty solid challenge, but have there been any other really big challenges or difficulties that you've had in your writing career?
Tying everything together in that third book, I was hell-bent on making it a trilogy, and there was a lot of loose ends at the end of the second book, a lot of storylines to bring a conclusion to. And the pacing of the third book is pretty rapid, but I didn't want it to go to 4 books. My life had become completely out of balance. My job, I was writing every spare moment of the day, all day on the weekends. I wasn't seeing my friends, wasn't spending time with my wife. I was like, I got to get this done. And so I didn't want to go an extra book. That was a huge challenge, bringing all that together.
If you had any advice or tips for other would-be authors out there, what would you say to them?
A young writer asked me to read her manuscript, and I read it, and when she's looking for the feedback, you're trying to be very supportive, but it was clearly a first draft. There's no beta readers. Like it was just a clear first draft, and first draft is not. Nobody's writing a perfect first draft.
No.
And what I told her, and I would tell anybody, is take this work seriously. And in so doing, take yourself seriously as a writer. If you're going to introduce a theme, if you don't know anything about the theme, then learn about it. If you're going to introduce, like this was a fantasy story, she was introducing all this stuff. I said, okay, look, if you're going to introduce, let's say, a desert-dwelling tribe of people that don't have good access to water, does it really make sense for them to be the peerless warriors? Because to become an effective peerless warrior, you have to train a lot, train hard.
Right.
And training a lot and training hard requires water for people. Mm-hmm. And so if they're coming from a desert where there's no water, then they're not. Like if you look at our world, the people that have adapted to the desert become small. They become non-combatant. They're living on the edge of, like the Kalahari Bushmen. Their hunting technique is very passive. They've devised a poison that, if it gets in an animal's bloodstream, they'll fall asleep and they can track the animal, slit its throat and sleep. But, they spend most of their day in inactivity because activity requires calories and water, and that's something they don't have. My point to her was, think like that. Think like that. Think like that with your characters. If they're having a dialogue, really get into the character and say, why are they saying this? How is it pertinent to the story? But ultimately, I just like, you take it seriously.
We're coming up on time here. How can readers connect with you, and how can they get copies of your work?
Go to Amazon. Just search on the S'Orne Saga. That's S''ORNE Saga. Or they could go to SteveRamirezBooks.com and find the links to those stories. And, I have a Facebook page. It's Steve Ramirez Books. Not hard to find. But I think I'm going to change. I'm actually looking at changing up some of my marketing, and I think I'm going to change it to SDRBooks.com. I've already got the domain reserved, and I'm going to change my Facebook page's name to SDR Books. But yeah, it's really the S'Orne Saga or The Great Migration by Steve Ramirez.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Garrett, it's been my pleasure to be here, and thank you for reaching out to me. I appreciate it.